Pink Floyd gave the world some of the greatest rock albums ever made. But behind the legendary music was a band collapsing under jealousy, ego, betrayal, and non-stop power struggles. Now, at 80 years old, Roger Waters is finally revealing what really destroyed Pink Floyd, and the truth is far darker than most fans ever imagined. From Syd Barrett's tragic downfall to the bitter war between Waters and David Gilmour, this is the shocking, untold story behind the rise and collapse of a rock empire. Ladies and gentlemen, the T-Set. Before becoming Pink Floyd, the group experimented with several strange and forgettable names. Over the years, they briefly called themselves the Megadeths, the Spectrum 5, the Screaming Abdabs, and even the T-Set. That last name actually fit the band's early psychedelic image, especially as Syd Barrett began leading the group deeper into the surreal, LSD-inspired sound that would later define their early music. But the name, the T-Set, did not last long, partly because another London band was already using it. Needing a new name quickly, Barrett came up with Pink Floyd almost on the spot while looking through his blues records. He combined the names of two Carolina blues musicians, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. According to Roger Waters, another possible name was Anderson Council, though he later joked it sounded like a local authority. In the end, Pink Floyd simply stuck, and eventually became one of the most famous names in rock history. Syd Barrett was afraid he would vanish. Would Pink Floyd even have existed without Syd Barrett? Many fans would argue no. Barrett was the band's creative force in the early days, and the main songwriter behind their 1967 debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. His surreal lyrics, strange imagination, and experimental sound helped shape Pink Floyd's identity before the world even knew who they were. Years later, Roger Waters reflected on Barrett's talent by saying, "What was so stunning about Syd's songs was, through the whimsy and the crazy juxtaposition of ideas and words, there was a very powerful grasp of humanity." He added, "They were quintessentially human songs." But while Syd's music captured human emotion brilliantly, he was slowly losing touch with reality himself. His growing use of LSD heavily influenced both his creativity and his mental decline. As Pink Floyd's fame increased, Barrett struggled more and more with the pressure of success. Friends and bandmates watched his behavior become increasingly unpredictable, distant, and disturbing. Eventually, after months of confusion and erratic performances, the band replaced him with David Gilmour in 1968. Barrett briefly attempted a solo career, but his decline continued. In one haunting 1971 interview, he quietly admitted, "I'm disappearing." Reporters described his eyes as being in a permanent state of shock. Over time, Syd withdrew almost completely from public life, returning to Cambridge to live privately and largely alone. He spent the rest of his life away from fame before dying from pancreatic cancer in 2006. Becoming one of rock music's most tragic and mysterious figures. Was Shine On You Crazy Diamond a tribute to Syd Barrett? Pink Floyd released Wish You Were Here in 1975, and the album quickly became another massive success, topping charts in both the United States and the United Kingdom while selling millions of copies worldwide. But behind the success was one of the most emotional moments in the band's history. During the recording sessions, former member Syd Barrett unexpectedly appeared at the studio. The shock was overwhelming. According to drummer Nick Mason, the band barely recognized him. David Gilmour later recalled that Barrett had gained a large amount of weight and had shaved off his eyebrows and hair, making him almost unrecognizable from the charismatic young man they once knew. Both Gilmour and Roger Waters were reportedly brought to tears by the encounter. The experience deeply influenced Shine On You Crazy Diamond, the haunting tribute Waters wrote for Barrett on the album. Waters later explained that he rewrote the lyrics several times while trying to capture the sadness surrounding Syd's disappearance from both the band and reality itself. Years later, however, Waters expanded on the song's meaning. In a 2018 interview, he said Sid had become more of a symbol than the song's sole subject. According to Waters, Shine On was ultimately about people withdrawing from the world because modern life had become too painful to face. Dark Side of the Moon helped fund a now cult classic comedy. The Dark Side of the Moon is widely considered one of the greatest rock albums ever made. Released by Pink Floyd in 1973, the album became a cultural phenomenon and stayed on the Billboard charts for an astonishing number of years. Between multiple chart runs and catalog rankings, Dark Side of the Moon spent roughly 1,500 weeks on the charts, helping turn Pink Floyd into one of the richest and most influential bands in music history. But the album also ended up connected to another legendary British phenomenon, Monty Python's Flying Circus. While recording the album, the members of Pink Floyd reportedly spent much of their free time watching the surreal comedy show and became huge fans. When the Monty Python team later struggled to finance their first major movie, studios refused to invest. Director Terry Gilliam later explained that the comedy group turned to wealthy rock stars for help because Britain's tax rates were extremely high at the time. Bands like Led Zeppelin, Elton John, and Pink Floyd stepped in financially, with Pink Floyd contributing a significant portion of the film's early budget. George Orwell inspired an entire album. Animal Farm became a major success after its release in the 1940s, using the story of farm animals overthrowing their owners as a warning about dictatorship and political corruption. Decades later, the novel heavily inspired Pink Floyd's 1977 concept album, Animals. The album marked another bold political statement from the band and helped pave the way for later projects like The Wall. Across just 5 songs, Roger Waters adapted Orwell's ideas into modern society, dividing people into symbolic groups. Pigs represented the powerful rulers. Dogs symbolized aggressive enforcers chasing wealth and control, while sheep represented the blind followers at the bottom. Even the album cover carried political meaning. The famous image of a giant inflatable pig floating above London's Battersea Power Station was designed to symbolize power, greed, and industrial authority, perfectly matching the themes Waters wanted to explore throughout the album. Spitting on a fan led to Pink Floyd's album, The Wall. In 1977, Pink Floyd performed at Montreal's Olympic Stadium in front of nearly 80,000 fans during what became one of the most infamous concerts of their career. The crowd was extremely chaotic, with constant shouting, drunken behavior, and fireworks exploding throughout the show. At one point, a firecracker reportedly went off dangerously close to Roger Waters' head, pushing him into a furious outburst. Waters repeatedly screamed at the audience to stop, but the chaos continued. According to several accounts, roadies eventually dragged one fan onto the stage after being blamed for the fireworks, and Waters spat directly in the man's face in frustration. The moment shocked both the audience and the band themselves. Years later, Waters admitted he had been angry, exhausted, and emotionally disconnected from the audience that night. But he also said the incident deeply disturbed him afterward because it made him realize how separated he had become from the fans he was supposed to connect with. That disturbing feeling directly inspired the concept behind The Wall, the idea of building a massive emotional barrier between himself and the outside world. The making of the movie, The Wall, was a disaster. In 1982, Pink Floyd. The Wall was released, bringing Pink Floyd's legendary album, The Wall, to the big screen. The film became a cult classic and earned critical praise, with Roger Ebert even calling it one of the greatest serious rock films ever made. But behind the scenes, the production was filled with tension and misery. Director Alan Parker later admitted he was proud of the movie, but described making it as an exhausting and unpleasant experience. Much of the conflict centered around Roger Waters, whose intense personality and strict creative control reportedly made collaboration extremely difficult. Parker said Waters could be intimidating whenever anyone suggested ideas that differed from his vision for the project. The stress also heavily affected cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, whose disturbing animations became one of the film's most iconic elements. According to reports, Scarfe became so anxious during production that he constantly carried whiskey to cope with the pressure. The experience damaged relationships badly. Parker later said he barely spoke to Waters for decades after the film's release, while Scarfe reportedly still shuddered whenever the project was mentioned years later. Pink Floyd performed at an ancient Roman amphitheater to no audience. The ancient amphitheater in Pompeii once held thousands of spectators for gladiator battles and public entertainment before the city was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Buried for centuries and later rediscovered, the haunting ruins eventually became the setting for one of the strangest and most unforgettable performances in rock history, Pink Floyd, live at Pompeii. Director Adrian Mabin later explained that he chose Pompeii because he loved the strange idea of a live performance taking place in a city long associated with death and silence. Instead of performing for a packed crowd, Pink Floyd played almost entirely alone, surrounded only by the film crew and a few local children who slipped into the amphitheater. The eerie combination of empty ruins, ancient stone, and Pink Floyd's hypnotic music created something unforgettable. Even the acoustics amazed the band and crew, who noticed how perfectly sound echoed through the Roman structure. Years later, David Gilmour admitted none of them expected the film to become such a lasting cultural phenomenon. They almost made an album entirely out of household objects. After the massive success of The Dark Side of the Moon in 1973, Pink Floyd tried to create an even stranger experimental follow-up. The project, called Household Objects, aimed to make music entirely from everyday items instead of traditional instruments. Feeling pressure to top their groundbreaking previous album, the band began experimenting with things like wine glasses, rubber bands, aerosol cans, and kitchen appliances. According to keyboardist Richard Wright, the unusual concept came largely from Roger Waters. The band reportedly spent weeks trying to make ordinary objects sound like real instruments. But eventually, frustration took over. Drummer Nick Mason later admitted they finally abandoned the idea because they simply could not keep pretending the project was working. Even so, parts of the experiment survived. Some of the eerie sounds created by rubbing wine glasses were later used in Shine On You Crazy Diamond on their 1975 album Wish You Were Here. Did Pink Floyd intend to follow the yellow brick road? The Dark Side of the Moon is widely considered Pink Floyd's greatest masterpiece. With more than 34 million copies sold, it became one of the best-selling albums in music history. Over the years, fans have analyzed every lyric, sound, and detail of the record, leading to countless theories, including one of the strangest music myths ever created. In the 1990s, a popular theory claimed that Dark Side of the Moon perfectly synced with the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. According to believers, the album's lyrics, sound effects, and song changes mysteriously matched scenes from the movie almost perfectly, creating what fans called Dark Side of the Rainbow. The idea became a huge pop culture phenomenon, but the band always denied it. Drummer Nick Mason later dismissed the theory completely, saying it was unthinkable that the band secretly created the album around the film or its star, Judy Garland. According to Mason, the supposed connection was nothing more than a strange coincidence that fans turned into a legend. Pink Floyd and Facebook? Heck no. The Wall became far more than just a successful album for Pink Floyd. Songs like Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, turned into major counterculture anthems, criticizing authority, conformity, and systems that crush individuality. Decades later, the message still resonates strongly with audiences around the world. That became obvious again in 2021 when social media giant Instagram reportedly approached Roger Waters about using another brick in the wall in an advertisement. Waters later revealed he was offered a huge amount of money, but immediately rejected the proposal. According to him, the song's message stood completely against what he believed companies like Facebook and Instagram represented. During a public event, Waters bluntly responded with, "Fuck you," while explaining that he believed large tech companies were trying to take over absolutely everything. He also said the core message behind the song, resisting oppression and protecting individuality, remained just as important today as when the album was first released. Roger Waters' relationship with his bandmates is turbulent. The members of Pink Floyd became locked in one of the most bitter feuds in rock history. By the early 1980s, tensions between Roger Waters and David Gilmour had grown so severe that many people around the band could already see a breakup coming. The conflict reached its peak during the making of the Final Cut in 1983, the last Pink Floyd album featuring Waters. Those involved later described the recording sessions as miserable, with constant arguments and creative clashes between Waters and Gilmour. In 1985, Waters officially left the band, convinced Pink Floyd would end without him because he believed the group was a spent force creatively. But the remaining members continued on without him and released A Momentary Lapse of Reason in 1987. Furious over the decision, Waters sued his former bandmates in an attempt to stop them from using the Pink Floyd name. The legal battle dragged on for years before eventually being settled out of court. Although the surviving members would later reunite briefly on stage, the bitterness lingered for decades. Years later, Waters finally admitted in an interview that trying to stop the band from continuing had been a mistake, bluntly saying, "Of course I was wrong. Who cares?"